Hi, my name is Linda, and this is my lecture review for Dr. Seeger's um, presentation on life in Venus. So, to summarize, she stated that life may exist in Venus due to the proof that phosphine exists in Venus. And what I learned was that phosphine even exists. I didn't know phosphine was even a thing, and it is actually quite rare on Earth, but it does have a lot of correlation to life because phosphine doesn't last long, and therefore somebody must be creating phosphine um, in order for it to even exist. So somebody's producing it. Therefore, she believes that this is due to life in Venus. Penguins also emit phosphine. That's a fun fact that I learned that I didn't know before. Life would need to exist aloft in Venus because the clouds have low water activity due to sulfuric acid. I learned that rainbows are polarized and that particles in nature do not scatter isotropically, meaning that when measured, particles in different directions are not in the same amount. So they vary in magnitude depending on where you measure them. Um, then there were also some things that I already knew, but it was just fun to recall this. I already knew that gases in a planet meant that there is life, especially gases like phosphine that have low durability, and therefore there must be something producing them. I also knew she mentioned it a lot about the controversy that life even exists in Venus and that there were a lot of counter arguments for it. But she mentioned it in more detail than I already knew. She mentioned that people argue for like the biochemistry and that there must be something like, for example, volcanoes producing these type of chemicals that are also correlated to life. Um, and just because there are certain gases, it doesn't mean that life exists in order to produce them. It just means something else in the planet is causing them. Then someone mentioned a question about what about life underneath the surface, and if we could get a probe to explore underneath the surface of Venus. But she mentioned that it would be hard due to the free fall, which I already knew because that's physics and chemistry, given that Venus has such a high atmospheric pressure due to the high carbon dioxide greenhouse atmosphere. And that also means that temperature in Venus is incredibly high, a little too high for life as we know it here on Earth. Um, then something that Dr. Seeger mentioned that did spark my curiosity was about Earth life biochemistry and how she wanted to do more research on the levels of sulfuric acid, which was why they were sending a probe in the first place. I don't know a lot about biochemistry, but I am very eager to understand what Earth life biochemistry means, which I know that it means life, but I'm just curious as to a greater detail on what it means. And I'm obviously very keen on finding if she finds any proof of life, because that would be very cool. And in respect to my own area of study, so if we look at this class, if we look at physics 2, at first glance, I thought that there was not much correlation. I found more correlation to physics 1 at first glance, just because she mentioned probes and she mentioned how it wouldn't survive the free fall, which is obviously just classical mechanics, very much Newtonian physics, a lot to do with like the gravity of Venus. However, then for physics 2, it occurred to me, well, there's the circuits in the probe and how it must like send signals back to Earth, which has to do with wavelengths. However, I remember that she mentioned the concept of Hadley cells and that Venus has a super rotating atmosphere, which means that the temperature in Venus does not vary much depending on location. Then she mentioned that Venus doesn't have a magnetic field like Earth's, meaning that Venus's magnetic field is much lower. And I followed up on this topic outside of the lecture, like afterwards. And I tried to understand why a low magnetic field has an implication on like the atmosphere, because I know that the atmosphere does affect the idea that life exists on a planet. I just didn't know the correlation between the magnetic field and the atmosphere as much. And I think that a low magnetic field means that it will lose ionized oxygen and carbon dioxide much faster from its atmosphere. However, with the concept of Hadley cells being mentioned, I followed up on this and I learned that Hadley cells is a pattern of atmospheric circulation in which basically warmer rises from the equator and cools down as it travels towards each of the poles at higher altitudes. So they control low altitude weather patterns. And I wanted to consider the relation between Hadley cells and the planetary magnetic field. So I did some research and I found a paper by Dr. Maria Kuman published in 2019, in which she just basically kind of studied the relationship between the magnetic field here on Earth and on Hadley cells, amongst other things that were outside of my scope for this lecture. But basically, a planetary magnetic field has a strong correlation with the hospitable environment, which life here on Earth thrives off of. And this is something that I think is very important to consider when thinking about life in Venus. Thank you.